Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Good morning and welcome. And it's very good to gather together on Shrove Tuesday, as is our pattern, as clergy and lay ministers from across the Diocese of Sheffield, ecumenical friends and colleagues and guests with us as well, to worship, to listen, to receive, to be together and to reflect together. The day will follow its traditional format. We'll have two inputs from Sam this morning, whom I'll introduce in a moment, each followed by questions, a few notices before our coffee break and probably before lunch, and then there's a time for reflection and processing what Sam has said and interaction with him this afternoon for those who are able to stay for that. It's a very great pleasure to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who is our lecturer for last night and today, as he comes to address the subject, Embodying the Story of Jesus. Sam is Vicar of St. Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square in London, a unique congregation and church which has an extensive ministry to homeless people across the capital, as well as being the centre of a flourishing music ministry and much else besides. Sam's been in that role for 2 years now. He was previously Dean of Chapel and Professor of Ethics at Duke Divinity School in the southern United States, one of the leading theological schools and colleges there, and before that served for 10 years in parishes in Newcastle, Cambridge and the Cambridge area and in Norfolk. So Sam, it's a real delight to have you here, to welcome you today. Sam is the author of around 20 different books, some of which are on sale at the back, and he will mention some of them, I'm sure, as we go through the morning as a way of following up on our learning from today. But please can we give a warm welcome to the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells.
Thank you, Bishop Stephen. It's a great honour and great pleasure to be with you today. I want you to imagine you're walking through Trafalgar Square, something I do every day, and you see a homeless person. I want to suggest you have 4 options. The first is to say we need to get people off the streets into housing, employment, and profitable use of time. You may be energized to join the board of a night shelter or a day centre assisting homeless people. You may be more direct and immediate and bring the homeless person in question a drink or a sandwich or an item of clothing or a leaflet advertising various services. If you're a person with professional skills, you may seek ways to bring your talents and facilities to their advantage. As a medical practitioner for their health, as an educationalist for their learning, as a lawyer for their legal situation, you may be motivated to advocate for this person and many people in similar circumstances, lobbying your political representative or bringing together a meeting to address homelessness in central London. That's option 1. The second option is to speak to the homeless person, to explore with them the reasons why they're homeless, to ensure they know what options are available for them. The local drug and alcohol rehabilitation schemes, the places where free health care is available, the drop-in centres where there's training and career advice, the places where there's art and singing and football groups to help build confidence and make connections, and to take them to these places now or later. One could also explore whether they know other homeless people, whether they together have common concerns, how they can work together on those questions, and whether they have a good sense of where those issues might find a hearing. That's option 2. The third option is simply to sit down beside the homeless person and pass the time of day with them, to share first names, to talk about where they're from, ask what it's like to spend a day or a night outside. Wonder what they think of people like yourself scurrying by, inquire if they feel frightened or lonely. Drink a cup of coffee with them, discuss the latest developments in politics or the arts or sports or celebrity culture, and gradually locate the questions they really want to ask and the wisdom they deeply have to share. Probably about Alan Pardew. and the nature of the headbutt. In this approach, the physical posture is as significant as what is actually said. No longer does the person with the problem sit while the person with the solution stands. Now the two sit together, and what they're talking about is not the deficit in the one and the surfeit in the other, but matters of common concern to both. That's number 3. And what about number 4? The fourth option is to feel rising anger about the fact that there are so many homeless people in central London, to denounce this situation on your blog site, to get very exercised about the use of the term the homeless instead of homeless people, to give money to appeals for organisations that work with homeless issues, and to make every effort to ensure that no one who meets a homeless person makes any assumptions about mental health or a history of being abused or substance addiction or poor choices. One may be quick to see homelessness as a symptom of a society ill at ease, and to find further symptoms that indicate barriers to human flourishing in government, the market, and the wider culture, barriers that may have a hidden, perhaps sinister, root cause. That's number 4. I want you to imagine those 4 options as like an old-fashioned window. Think play school if you go back to that cultural location, the square window. So we've got 4 possibilities here, but they relate to each other. I'm going to call the first option up here working for. Because when you go on boards and lobby politicians, you're working for the homeless person. Both words are significant. You're clearly working because you're directly engaging obstacles that stand in the homeless person's path. And you're working for the person in that the person has not been the instigator of the work nor an active participant in it. It's being done on their behalf to enhance their well-being. If you noted in the way that I narrated option number 1, you never actually spoke to the homeless person. You knew what was good for them, and you went ahead and did it. That's working for. That's up here in this quadrant up here. And the second approach is working with. That's in this quadrant over here. Working with shares the energy of the first option, identifying and addressing barriers, and in this case, building coalitions of people with common issues, and then so far it's working. But this time the work is in partnership alongside the homeless person, actually engaging them in their own redemption rather than deciding and operating for them. So it's not for, but with. So that's the option over here. The third approach, where you simply sit beside the homeless person for a coffee and a chat, is this one down here, bottom on the right. That's being with. Like the second option, it's a genuine encounter. The two parties are equally involved, and the engagement only proceeds if they both continue to be so. Hence, it's with. But it's not, in the same way, working. It focuses much more on stillness, on disposition, on letting the homeless person take the decisive steps and identify the significant issues. Thus, it's not working, but being. And the fourth option is being for. You don't actually encounter the homeless person at all. Your every judgment is based on information received at a distance or wisdom gained second or third hand. Thus, it's not with, but for. Meanwhile, there's not an active pursuit of the homeless person's interests, which would be working. Instead, there's an orientation of one's whole life for their well-being and the well-being of many others who are, as you perceive it, casualties of the economic, political, or social system. Thus, it's being. So we've got those 4 models: working for, working with, and being for. The ones on this side are both for, the ones above the line here are both working, over here it's with. down here it's being. You get the idea. I'm just going to pause for a moment there and invite you as people in ministry to reflect on your own for just 30 seconds about the last 7 days of your ministry and reflect on how much time you've spent in each of those 4 quadrants. I hesitate to interrupt you because there's, after all, nothing more interesting than one's own life and ministry. But I'm going to get back to Jesus for a moment, if you don't mind. I just want to pause for a second time, though. This isn't going to be the main subject of what I'm talking about, certainly in the first talk this morning, but I'll come back to it in the second talk. I just want you to reflect for a moment on what it would be like to imagine Jesus' ministry under these 4 headings. Let's imagine for a moment that Jesus spent a week in Jerusalem working for us, doing what we couldn't do, securing our salvation. That Jesus spent 3 years in Galilee working with us, being a community organizer, gathering a team, training them, bringing out their gifts, setting them on a path. And Jesus spent 30 years in Nazareth being with us. Who knows what he was doing? Not working, not achieving our salvation in any significant way, just enjoying us, because there was nothing better to enjoy. And if you look painfully, as we do in Lent, that's what Lent's all about, into the mirror of our own soul and say, look at my ministry. I mean, the fact that we call it my ministry is a bit of a problem, isn't it? But given that, look at the ministry that I've been given and how I've spent that talent. Can I really honestly say that I've spent 90% of it being with God and other people? That I've spent 9% of it working with, and that I've spent 1% of it working for? Or do I so much enjoy the working for that actually the percentage is the other way round? And if my percentage is the other way round, am I kind of saying that I think Jesus really made a lot of stupid mistakes in his time management, and that I've got a better time management model because I've been on this leadership training scheme? That Jesus actually wasted 90% of his ministry in non-strategic ways. Is that what my life is saying as I look at it this Lent? So I'm going to leave that with you, because that's the background of everything I'm going to say for the next couple of hours, divided by coffee. But that's the real question that I'm asking. But I want to ask that question in this first talk through the lens of social engagement, justice ministry, or whatever we want to call it. And then after the break, I'm going to talk about it more directly theologically. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through the reasons why I think being with is basically what it's all about. But I'm going to do so by offering a critique of the other 3 quadrants: working for, working with, and being for. And I'm doing that because if our lives, most of us as clergy and lay ministers, don't offer a great model of a real conviction about being with, just look at the way the rest of the world spends its time. The rest of the world is given over to these other 3 models. I'm going to suggest a few reasons why I think they're flawed. Okay, so I'm going to start by having a dig at working for. I'm going to call this little part, the next 10 minutes or so, the pathos of working for. The simplest model of working for is a contract by which an expert is hired to perform a limited task that a person left to themselves could perform only badly or perhaps not at all. Thus, a lawyer is hired to represent a client in legal proceedings, an accountant is called in to put a person's financial affairs in order, a dentist, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to live without my dentist. A dentist is needed to address a troublesome tooth, a doctor is needed when a patient is suffering from an injury or illness, or a mechanic is approached to set right a fault or a point of damage in a car. In each case, the expert is involved for a given period of time and is rewarded with money, the satisfaction of a job well done, the sense of having brought to a third party comfort, relief, pleasure or rescue, and the social prestige of being an expert in a valued field. There are a number of things to note about working for. The most significant is that it dominates the Western imagination in relation to social disadvantage. The have-nots are defined by what they lack, and this lack is made up of both materials and skills. The haves are defined by what they have, and again, this is defined in terms of materials and skills. If there's a problem, the assumption is that the problem lies with the have-nots and the haves will solve it. The political divide is between, on the one hand, those who want to reward the haves, increase their number, make it easier to become one of them, tighten the demands on the have-nots, so they're motivated to do whatever it takes to become one of the haves, and highlight the degree of choice involved at each stage. I think you recognize what I'm talking about there. And on the other hand, those who want to protect the have-nots, provide a safety net for them, reduce their vulnerability to an adverse turn of events, offer them promising routes towards becoming one of the haves, in the meantime giving them enough to avoid destitution and highlighting the lack of choice that exists in such situations. I hope you recognize the profile of that kind side of the argument. In this configuration, the expectation is simple. Become one of the haves and spend your life working for the have-nots. This is the underlying ethos of professional culture. To become, through education and advanced training, extremely good at what you do, and to spend your life doing it for people. People will be drawn to your services either because your expertise is well suited to address a part of their lives where they're vulnerable or needy, or because your expertise is so great that it's worth having for its own sake. Working for plays a vital and indispensable role in a healthy society. When all is well, a chain of interdependence arises by which every member has a skill to bring, is suitably rewarded for doing so, attains the social standing, satisfaction, appreciation, and economic stability that arises from doing something for someone that they couldn't do as well or at all for themselves, and thus in return experiences no hardship or humiliation at securing the services of others to assist them in the same way. There is nothing to denigrate in this. There's no reason to challenge, abolish, expose, or regret in this series of occasional and respectful transactions and relationships, but two things can go wrong. The first lies in the word for. When the differences of social standing are very great, the dynamics can change significantly. The whole interaction presupposes that the disadvantaged person, in our example, the homeless person, has nothing to bring to the table. They're regarded as a problem and as a symptom of a deeper problem. The working for approach seeks to fix that problem with the range of resources the professional person has to hand. There's no requirement that any significant kind of conversation or interaction takes place with any homeless person at all. The idea that the homeless person may have a role in their own redemption doesn't seriously figure. The result is that these models generate a host of solutions, but they're solutions that tend to get little or no take-up from the people they're designed to help. Why are people so ungrateful? How much of our time do we spend asking ourselves that question? Most likely because almost every interaction in your life is one in which you are the client and source of distress, while the other person is the benefactor and source of salvation, you're not going to be looking for extra encounters that reinforce such humiliation. The sense of being a problem solver is electric. The sense of being a problem to be solved is humiliating. On closer inspection, it becomes clear that conventional working for relationships generally presuppose a degree of working with. For example, a lawyer can't easily represent a client unless an understanding and sharing of information has taken place between them. A doctor can't best serve a patient unless a conversation has taken place about symptoms and about living well after treatment to aid recovery. An accountant needs a good deal of information from a client in order to be able to address their finances appropriately. But in addressing social disadvantage, this degree of with, this partnership, this sense that both parties have a role to play, can quickly disappear. To the extent that the with disappears, the relationship becomes problematic. One writer in this field, John McKnight, asks an uncomfortable question. In a service economy, he says, the welfare recipient is the raw material for caseworkers, administrators, doctors, lawyers, mental health workers, drug counsellors, youth workers, and police officers. Do the services need the recipient more than she needs them? McKnight characterizes what I'm calling working for as a worldview that defines our lives and societies as a series of technical problems. The services provided in this configuration are, he says, masked by symbols of care and love that obscure the economic interests of the services and the disabling characteristics of their practices. McKnight portrays the following template that the professionalized service systems communicate to their clients. You are deficient. You are the problem. You have a collection of problems. As you are the problem, the assumption is that I, the professional servicer, am the answer. You are not the answer. Your peers are not the answer. The political, social, and economic environment is not the answer, nor is it possible that there is no answer. I, the professional, am the answer. I, the professional, produce. You, the client, consume. We will have reached the apogee of the modernized service society when professionals can say to the citizen, we are the solution to your problem. We know what problem you have. You can't understand the problem or the solution. Only we can decide whether the solution has dealt with your problem. Inverted in terms of the needs of professionalized service systems, these propositions become, we need to solve your problem. We need to tell you what they are. We need to deal with them in our own terms. We need to have you respect our satisfaction with our own work. McKnight concludes that the national economy rests on these professionalized systems. Yet these systems consistently fail to meet their own goals. Rather than producing services, these systems are producing sensitive but frustrated professionals, unable to understand why their love, care, and service do not reform society, much less help individuals to function. The other thing that can go wrong lies in the word working. Working becomes a habit of mind. It comes to assume that everything can be configured within the same trajectory of problem and solution, and that all relationships are, by default, ones in which I have the answer and others simply have questions. If you are the one with a hammer in your pocket, everything looks like a nail. What becomes important is not so much that a person's well-being is enhanced, their suffering alleviated, their agency empowered, but that you yourself have played a crucial role. Working can be so self-absorbed that what becomes most important is that the person with the skills gets the opportunity to use them. I say this because I spent 7 years at Duke University, and Duke University was absolutely fantastic at brain surgery. And it used to go all the way around the world, seeing the world's problems, working out how many of them could be solved by brain surgery. Turns out it wasn't a very high number. But brain surgery was what Duke University Hospital did extremely well. So it kept on offering brain surgery to places all around the world and being disappointed that this didn't produce gratitude and joy. That's what I call having the hammer in your pocket and seeing everything looking like a nail. If what the person needs falls outside one's own range of expertise or availability, it can't be my problem because I don't have problems. I provide solutions. It must instead be their problem, and by having an inappropriate or unsuitable problem, they thereby lose the right to have it solved. Working can become an elaborate exercise in avoiding the pathos of the world by limiting one's engagement in it to the places where one can make a positive, tangible, immediate and financially rewarded impact. That may be good for one's self-esteem and alleviate any lurking sense of despair, but it may not be especially good for the world or serve anyone's well-being besides one's own. These points may be illustrated with a domestic example. Parenthood, something that many people here will know about, may seem like the definitive working for. A tiny baby is the epitome of dependent need, and a new parent may be overwhelmed by the degree of self-denial required in meeting such insistent and relentless needs. But the joy of parenthood is the gradual emergence of the with. From the cooperation over feeding to the assistance in walking to the sharing in reading to the delight in playing together. If parenthood is simply for, it becomes either a burden or an exercise in control. If a growing child experiences childhood as simply being on the receiving end of for, they can only come to resent the humiliation or adapt and seek to replicate it in subsequent relationships. In parenthood, there must be a strong degree of for, but the for is a provisional arrangement designed to lead to with. Adulthood names the time when there is no more for. No need or purpose or health in a relationship based on for. Meanwhile, if parenthood is all working for and no being with, it is a labor-inducing guilt rather than a gift-inviting joy. The struggle of parenthood is when to save time by doing up the shoelaces for, and when to support growth and development by sitting on the stairs and being with as the struggles over the shoelaces continue into yet another chapter. In such particulars does the journey from for to with play out. I'm going to leave to your imagination what that analogy means for international aid, for example. Okay, let's move on to the dynamics of working with. This is Galilee, if you like, if working for is Jerusalem and being with is Nazareth. The dynamics of working with. Returning to the homeless person in Trafalgar Square, we looked at two models, working with and being with, that differ significantly from and seek to address the deficiencies in working for. Working with and being with both presuppose genuine, serious and sustained interaction with the homeless person. Such interaction can be demanding, time-consuming and lacking in adrenaline. The word with indicates that both models take for granted that the homeless person must be at the heart of whatever takes place, that there can be no transformation without agency. Working with seeks to gather round a whole range of stakeholders and see the homeless person as having a crucial contribution alongside service providers and concerned organizations. It's a much more dynamic model than working for, and sensitive to a much wider range of contributions than simply professional expertise. Perhaps the figure that today that most closely associated with the practices of working with is the Chicago-raised broad-based organizer Saul Alinsky. Could I just do a quick show of hands who's come across Saul Alinsky? Yeah, a good smattering. I mean, if the phrase community organizing means anything to you, he's the guru. In one of his books, he says, "The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold on to power. Rules for radicals is written for the have-nots on how to take it away." Organizing is central to Alinsky's practice of working with. He took membership not as an individual matter, but as an institutional commitment. He didn't gather people around issues, but sought first of all to build relationships. Once gathered, the organization sought to be a broad-based coalition, not a narrow or sectional interest group. Political strategy remained non-partisan to avoid co-option by influential politicians or by the state. Organizing resembled a craft with rules that members became apprenticed into. One feature that never changed was a strong trickster element. Alinsky delighted to tease, embarrass, and outwit his adversaries in playful and subversive ways. Among the many tactics Alinsky developed, practiced, and propagated, the following offer a representative sample. Never do for someone something they can do for themselves. That's Alinsky's golden rule. Never do for someone something they can do for themselves. No permanent allies, no permanent enemies. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Never go outside the experience of your people. Wherever possible, go outside the experience of your enemy. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. Think about Martin Luther King Jr. there. Ridicule is your most potent weapon. A good tactic is one that your people enjoy. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Keep the pressure on. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And then perhaps his best known, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. It would be hard to find a more succinct summary of the methods of working with. For Geoffrey Stout, who's a philosopher of religion at Princeton University, wrote a fascinating book called Blessed Are the Organized. For Geoffrey Stout, the heart of broad-based organizing is public accountability. He says, power minus accountability equals domination. He seeks not to level societies, but to establish structures of earned and accountable authority. This requires organizing because, as he says, to achieve a relationship of mutual recognition with public officials and other elites in the broader political community, a citizens' organization has to put officials in a position of needing to negotiate with it. The task of citizens' organizations is to make this culture of accountability a perpetual and vigilant rather than episodic and occasional affair. He says the spokesperson who, acting on behalf of others, holds officials accountable in meetings of various kinds, expects to be held accountable in turn by the ordinary citizens on whose behalf she speaks, as well as by the officials she addresses. Democracy resides in these relations of accountability. Thus, every element of for is scrutinized to ensure it never neglects the with. And yet Stout has an abiding respect for because of his emphasis on the representative democratic process. Perhaps the best known exponent of working with, somebody I think you'll all have heard of, in relation to global poverty today is the Bangladeshi banker and economist Muhammad Yunus. Yunus's Grameen Bank has pioneered and modeled the practice of lending money with no collateral to landless women in impoverished communities and then setting up support structures to help them develop their businesses and encourage one another. The solidarity groups make joint applications for loans and the members act as co-guarantors for repayment, thus making tangible the principle of partnership in enterprise. The women subscribe to a covenant with 16 decisions, including, we shall follow and advance the 4 principles of Grameen Bank: discipline, unity, courage, and hard work in all walks of our lives. And we shall not take any dowry at our sons' weddings, neither shall we give any dowry at our daughter's wedding. We shall keep our centre free from the curse of dowry. We shall not practice child marriage. With a business acumen to match the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, another classic working with exponent, and the tactical nous of Saul Alinsky that I've just described, The Grameen Bank offers a complementary model of working with based on empowering women to make their own way out of poverty. So I've tried to give a sympathetic sense of the intellectual, relational, transformational, democratic and economic appeal of working with. At their most attractive, such initiatives can seem like a secular congregation, with all the camaraderie, fellow feeling, energy and mutual respect of a church, but with perhaps a greater sense of tangible results, social change, empowerment, forward momentum, and victory through confrontation. I don't know if you have a movement like this in Sheffield, but in London we have a movement called London Citizens, which operates almost entirely on the Alinsky model. Many congregations are affiliated to it. There's an ongoing debate at St. Martin's about whether we should or shouldn't be affiliated to it, and it campaigns for things like the London Living Wage. I don't know if you're familiar with these kinds of community organising practices, but one of the fascinating things for this gathering about them is that they operate like a kind of secular church. Most criticisms of working with approaches focus not on any perceived weakness of the theory, but more on the inevitable failures to live up to the high ideals. So you find people saying how money has gone astray in Bangladesh, or opponents have been not treated with dignity in community organising meetings, and so on. I'm not going to dwell on those, but what I want to say here is that the good thing about working with is it addresses the problems that I identified in working for. In other words, it trusts those who are disadvantaged. It doesn't assume that all expertise has to be imported from elsewhere. It believes that the seeds of a community's redemption lie wholly or largely within that community. It harnesses a diversity of schools, relying on local skills, relying on local wisdom and experience, but also capitalizing on the responsibilities and commitments of those in positions of wealth, influence, and authority. People who get carried away with community organizing really do get carried away with community organizing. It becomes, it takes over their whole life. It really is like a kind of conversion process. Well, clearly, I think there's a lot to be said for this. I'm very sympathetic to working with. What's wrong with working with? I'm just going to offer a couple of critiques. The first is what we might call the perpetual motion of working with. Where working with differs from being with is that working with still sees a problem, albeit one that's shared by a range of different people and bodies. In broad-based organising, the whole dynamic is to focus on a problem, isolate it, polarize in relation to it, and then bring together a short-term coalition of stakeholders to address it and resolve it. The process depends on the energy released and the momentum gained by problem solving. This can be inspiring and constructive, and bonding and empowering. The question is whether it's an end in itself. One might react with horror and say, but when people are suffering, are oppressed, are discriminated against and marginalized and terrorized, what could be more important than helping them find the strength and the methods to find their own redemption? Of course. But habits die hard, and the habits formed in addressing poverty and disadvantage may abide in other realms. Working with is an admirable way of seeking change. All it needs to ensure is that it sees being with as its foundation and its goal. Being with should be the foundation of working with, lest working with fall into becoming a technique. Broad-based organising begins with one-on-one conversations in people's homes with genuine care and concern for individuals' experiences and aspirations and wisdom and talents. The discernment that brings about the process of isolating and polarising around a problem arises out of these extensive interviews. That's all terrific, but when this with is diminished, when the methods of Eunice or Alinsky are introduced as a technique without the underlying preparation or groundwork or genuine encounter with a people, then it's not a genuine working with, but a different version of the invasion of the experts. In other words, a working for. And that's what we found. People have got very excited about the Grameen Bank. They've said Bangladesh. They've sent, a couple of fact-finding tours to Bangladesh to find out how it's done. They brought it back to England or America, and it hasn't worked. And that's because it's become a technique, which is a for, rather than a genuine with. But being with should just as importantly be the goal of working with. Working with offers more than a glimpse of God's purposes for us and a profound analogy for the dynamics of church. But it still presupposes an adversarial contest of defeating and overcoming. It still speaks the language of problem and solution, and it still assumes an occasionalistic picking off of challenges one by one. If life is nothing but a series of small victories, of momentum and good spirits maintained by the building of coalitions with no permanent allies or enemies, then there builds up a fear of this process ever stopping. Conflict and its overcoming through organizing or conscientization becomes the lifeblood of a people rather than the means to its liberation. The question for the meek is not just how and when they'll inherit the earth, it's what they'll do with it so as to enjoy it and keep it. Being with is more than anything else an eschatological notion, a depiction of what it means to live everlastingly, to enter eternal life, to feed on the nourishment that never runs out, and to share the things that are always in abundant supply. If working with doesn't long for and articulate these things, it's in danger of substituting one kind of scarcity for another. I think the other problem with working with is its reflexive, the extent of its reflective character. What I mean by that is that last night I was retelling the story of the Good Samaritan. Can I just have a quick wave of anyone who was there last night? Okay, just me and the bishop. Okay. Well, I'll give you a bit more than just a wave then. What I was saying last night is that we tend to read the Good Samaritan story as a working for story. In other words, the Good Samaritan is the great working for guy. He's got all the medicine in his pocket. And when we read the words, go and do likewise, we think we should be like the Samaritan. But actually, if you see that the telling of the story is the locating of Israel as the man in the road, as the one that has been beaten and stripped and left half dead by all the invaders, by the various people who've invaded Israel in the 700 years before Christ. If you see Israel as the man in the road, and if you see Jesus as the Samaritan, then you can come to see ourselves as the man in the road. We become the needy ones, and the difficulty isn't us finding the energy and resources to be good Samaritans. The difficulty is us having the humility to recognize that the form in which Jesus comes to us is as the most despised person in our society. It's a different way of reading the story. My problem with working with is that it makes us better Samaritans, but it still fails to see that we are fundamentally the man in the gutter. In other words, our approach to engaging poverty isn't fundamentally either assuming we've got all the answers, the working for with, and these ungrateful poor people have just got to get better at receiving it from us. That's the working for caricature. The working with caricature is that the Samaritan gets into this, we are the Samaritan, we get into a much more collaborative relationship with the guy in the gutter, but we still are very aware of the skills we're bringing into that context. If we see ourselves as the needy person in the gutter, if we see ourselves as actually needing to bring forth from the oppressed person, the Samaritan, all the gifts that God has given them, that's much more of a being with model of engagement. We are bringing forth from them out of our articulation of our need. A transformative moment for me was as an undergraduate. My first year as an undergraduate, I became very close friends with another man in the dorm, as it were, and then he became very seriously ill. And I spent a lot of the next few months sort of taking him lunch from the cafe and trying to work for him in those kinds of ways. And I remember saying to him on occasion, rather with trepidation, I said to him, could you do me a favour? And what it was, of course, I wanted to borrow his bike because I'd had mine stolen. And I knew he had a bike and I knew he hadn't used it for the last year. But I felt he was so sort of needy. I felt I was exploiting him by even taking his bike, even though he didn't need it. So I said, could you do me a favor? But he didn't know all of this at that stage. And I remember, I've never forgotten, it was a transformative moment in my life. It's probably the reason why I started, single biggest reason why I started working on all this stuff. He said, what could I ever do for you? And from then on, I think I began to realize that actually finding really genuinely authentic things that he could do for me was actually much more valuable than bringing him lunch. And that's the transition in ministry that I'm trying to offer you today, is that in ministry we get into this working for mentality, particularly about social disadvantage. It kicks into all of our guilt, particularly those of us who haven't come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we become better and better at bringing lunch. Whereas the lunch was fine for him, he would have found a way to get hold of some food without me. The transformative moment was from a very mixed collection of motives. I'm not being dishonest about the fact I really just wanted his bike. But that was the transformative moment. For the first time, for the last 9 months, he had something in his life where he could actually offer something to somebody else. And the being with model of engaging poverty is finding authentic and genuine ways in which people can actually offer you something back, because actually we all like to be creative. We all want to be in the working for role. Creating genuine ways in which disadvantaged people can actually offer working for models, it was just as simple as the bike in that case, is what it's all about. So I'm just going to finish this first lecture by going over the limitations of being for. You might think this is low-hanging fruit in a sense that I've already sort of teased about the blog site and stuff about being for, but I'm going to just sort of twist the knife a little bit here, because I can. But genuinely, being for is becoming more and more the model of social engagement in our culture. I mentioned the blog site because actually it's becoming more and more widespread to feel that by writing angry and well-informed things on a website, you're somehow doing something about poverty. You're not. Frankly, it's being for. It's a very safe place to be. You never need to meet a disadvantaged person at all. You don't actually do anything. You're just, writing well-opinioned things, and they're often very well written. And I think they're absolutely marvelous. But they offer, to me, no model of the Christian life in any significant way at all. So, am I being fair by having a go at being for in this way? There's an honoured place for working for. In a crisis, sometimes it's the only model that makes any sense. An accident happens, an ambulance is needed, an abscess develops that only a dentist can deal with, a lawyer steps in to address a complex immigration tangle, floods devastate a region, and helicopters are required to rescue survivors. In such cases, working for is a largely unproblematic and greatly to be valued model. And I've offered you a lot of positive examples of working with, but being for seems to lack these positive features, either necessity or holiness. But there are examples of where a being for has a distinguished history. When a person is restricted by advanced age, infirmity, or geographical isolation, or when in retirement or recuperation, after years of being with and working with, they're no longer on the front line of engagement, there may be much that they can do in shaping consciousness, fostering cultures of commitment, supporting with money or the written word, practicing a simplicity of life and a witness of intercessory prayer and meekness of heart. After all, the whole tradition of contemplative monasticism assumes that being with God is the single most important thing one can do to be for one's neighbour, and thus that all for is underwritten by a fundamental divine with. What may look like for can include significant elements of with. When a person commits to writing regular letters and messages to a prisoner in death row or a political prisoner, even the limitations of geography and mobility can turn a commitment of for into the tangible, almost sacramental reality of with. I was having a poignant conversation just yesterday afternoon with a friend of mine who's been housebound for the last 10 years, and he said to me, I can't do what you do, go out and about and run a church and do this sort of stuff. What can I do? It was a very poignant moment. And I just said to him, have you ever thought about writing to a prisoner on death row in the States? You know, it's something you can actually do. He's so powerless from being housebound, he doesn't know what to do, but there is a beauty in that, because it's a kind of a for thing, but there's a with. But I said, you know, before you start this, you're going to have to recognize that most likely that person's going to die, and this correspondence is going to come to an end. And that might break your heart. So don't do it lightly. And that's the cost of with. You don't get that cost in for. Likewise, a person may sense a call to step back from the front line of with, and thus practice being for, but in such a way that involves being and working with those who will one day be on that front line. Thus, a teacher may resolve to make sure her students understand issues of poverty, grasp the reciprocal nature of with, and are aware of their own neediness and how vital, unavoidable, and precious awareness of that neediness is in inspiring and sustaining their engagement with disadvantaged people. Such a teacher may also create opportunities for limited interactions across social divides and explore with the students a range of methods of interacting with such questions. All of this is being for, but exercised in such a way that it involves a profound degree of working with and being with many who themselves may be inspired to go beyond being for. In the same way, a parent may believe his most important role for a season is not to be face-to-face with disadvantage, but to provide an environment where his children may come to cherish and practice that commitments of working with and being with, perhaps without the risk of overexposure at too tender an age. I'm sure many people here today will have faced exactly the same kind of questions in bringing up their own children about whether to be with the disadvantaged head on at a time when their own children are vulnerable to what that overexposure could mean for the rest of their lives and commitments. So these are all forms of being for that I see as plausible and appropriate in their own contexts, but the important thing to note about all of them is that they presuppose the priority of with. For may have its place for a period due to reasons of pedagogy, infirmity, or indisposition, but with is the norm. There's a chap called Paul Lichterman who did a really fascinating study about what I would call being for. He studied community and church groups in an American town he calls Lakeburg. He looked at a wide range of well-intentioned groups with admirable ideals. Many had utopian visions, prophetic convictions, and radical critiques of government and the wider culture. But almost none of them had any significant influence or impact beyond its own members. Only one of all the groups Lichterman studied managed to break out of its own ideological purity and internal politics. I wonder if you've ever been a member of one of those groups. What that single group managed to do was to form relationships of cooperation with other groups in the town, especially including those whose views of promoting change differed from their own, and genuinely listen to the members of those groups whose members were drawn from all sections of local society. It was able to learn from these interactions and alter some of its ways of working accordingly, making such alterations part of its identity. So what Lichterman's study is able to do is highlight the flaws in being for. Being for may vote, being for may write editorials, being for may donate money, being for may compile research. But being for, while assuming something must be done, generally assumes it's for someone else actually to do the doing. Being for shares with working for the assumption that the destiny of disadvantaged people fundamentally lies elsewhere than in their own hands. It tends to be just as committed as working for to solutions, but it's inclined to find greater reasons for inaction, sometimes underwritten by complex suspicions about the true holders of power or the real dynamics behind the exercise of control. It often generates a great deal of anger, much of which may be directed towards those whose salaries or lifestyles seem impervious to the claims of the disadvantaged other or the nostrums of arm's-length solidarity. But this anger hints at a sense of powerlessness, and that powerlessness is precisely what the other three approaches seek in their different ways to dismantle. The trouble with being for is that it often increases the sense of powerlessness by finding endless complexities and complications and reasons for being sensitive and not imposing and being respectful and in avoiding risk. Being for can get so preoccupied with the right language or the best starting point or the purity of its motives or the guarantee of its outcomes that the poor remain at as great a distance as they would if there were no good intentions at all. These are all the reasons being for doesn't default to the working for model, and it seldom, if ever, defaults to any other model. There's an appropriate fear of quietism and cynicism and passive disengagement, the sins of the priest and the Levite who walked by on the other side. And there's an attraction in solutions in the sense that problems can be fixed, in the heritage of the great social reformers and philanthropists who righted the wrongs of the early industrial era. This is the appeal of working for, particularly when it highlights and harnesses one's own particular skills. Working for, as I hope you've gathered is my idea, working for is usually a good deal better than being for. Working for at least assumes we ourselves must be part of the doing. But as the illustration of the homeless person in Trafalgar Square showed, in working for just as much as in being for, we seldom know the homeless person by name and almost never regard them as our teacher. And to that degree, working for is a model that ensures the homeless person remains a stranger to us. I'm going to stop there for now, because I've done my best effort to demolish the credibility of working for, working with, and being for, although to respect that they all have their place, particularly the first two, in a range of responses to poverty. But I want to just end on a theological note and just question perhaps an assumption that we maybe bring into our preaching and bring into our ministries. And that is the theme that you may have noticed I've returned to over and over again is this notion of problems and fixing them and thinking in terms of solutions. You can get very, very frustrated. I mean, this is something I picked up on from 7 years in the United States, where the word fix is almost universal. You even do it for drinks and supper. You do it for everything. Everything gets fixed. But my reflection on my own experience of life and ministry is that almost nothing really gets fixed. It has to be lived with, shared, seen from a different angle, endured, outlasted, and all those sorts of things. There are very few things can be fixed, because you can fix a child's toy, but you don't get the same satisfaction in ministry very, very often. You have to find other ways to outlast the situations you face. So the thing I want to leave you with at the end of this first talk, and the second talk will be a much more directly theological talk, but I wanted to ground the first one in a very concrete place of encountering social disadvantage, because this is Sheffield, for goodness sakes, one of the 5 most deprived dioceses in the country. Most of you day to day are dealing with these problems of social disadvantage all the time, and I wanted to give you some language to grapple with these things. But to bring it back to a theological perspective, does God see the world as a problem to be fixed? Is the incarnation and passion of Christ a solution to a problem? And then coming back to perhaps what I regard as probably the most significant theological question of them all, when I used to interview other faculty members for new places on the faculty at Duke, this is the question I would always ask them, because I think it's the answer to this question is so telling. If there had never been a fall, would Jesus still have come? If there had never been a fall, in other words, does Jesus come to fix a problem? Or does Jesus come out of the overflowing love of God that could never not be with us as tangibly as we could possibly imagine and beyond? I mean, you can tell my answer to that question. I don't understand Jesus as being sent to fix a problem, as a sort of Superman. I understand And likewise, being with is not a way of fixing people's problems. It is two things. It's first of all enjoying the person for the glory of their createdness. And it's secondly, like the moving towards seeing ourselves in the gutter in the Good Samaritan story, it is actually seeing others as the solution to our problems rather than ourselves as the solution to theirs. The verse in the Bible I find most difficult isn't something about Gog and Magog and gnashing and swiping in Joshua. It's more blessed to give than to receive. Because actually I think most of ministry is finding creative and imaginative ways to receive. Those of you who are in socially deprived areas, but it's no different anywhere, class fades away in the end. But those of you in the socially deprived areas, I'm sure will find that the most satisfying experiences you have are not when you did this dynamic ministry with this great worship band or this great clean-up event that transformed your community out of the sheer strength of your own elbows. The most satisfying things is when you found that people for the first time in their lives came into your church building and made music or made a wonderful art project and said, I didn't realize my gifts were of any value to people like you. That's the most transformative experiences in ministry, when you found a way to receive. And to me, the most astonishing thing about God is not that God is able to snap those fingers and send Jesus to fix the problem of us. It's the fact that God enjoys and receives the fragile and clumsy offerings that we bring, which in the end is our lives and our ministries. End of part 1. Do we have time for, or do we, the call of coffee may be more urgent. The call of coffee is extremely urgent, so we're going to hold questions and stuff. Talk to your friends, and are you doing notices? Yeah, sorry, notices. Notices.